Greetings and welcome to Belonging Through Resistance and Change. My name is Keenan Colquitt. I use he, him, his programs. I serve as the Program Manager for Diversity Scholar Engagement with the National Center for Institutional Diversity, NCID, at the University of Michigan. We begin this presentation with a land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Three Fires Confederacy made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially through the treaty at the foot of the rapids. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. So with this being completed, I am happy to welcome our moderator, Dr. Kira Shahid, who is director of William Monroe Trotter Multicultural Center here at U of M. Dr. Shahid earned a PhD in educational leadership from Miami University. 2018, she published Anti-Black Racism and Epistemology, Violence, expanding her dissertation research on culturally restorative responses to the intersections of race and spirituality in higher education. She also earned a master's degree in student affairs and higher education from Miami University. Dr. Shahid is a Detroit native and proud first-generation graduate from Central State University, where she received her BA in broadcast communication and became a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Dr. Shahid, good to see you, my friend.
Good to be here. Thank you, Keenan. Happy to be in the space. I help to facilitate today's conversation for what I hope to be an incredible experience. And so I'm going to ask our panelists to join us as we begin this conversation. I want to introduce to you Dr. Charles H.F. Davis III, who is assistant professor for the Marshall Family School of Education. And my good brother, it's good to see you. Dr. Royale Johnson is also joining us. Royale is the Associate Professor and Director of the National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climates in the USC Race and Equity Center. Good to see you, Royale. And then finally, my soror is in the space, Dr. Britt Williams, who comes to us from the University of Vermont as Assistant Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs Administration. Excited to see the three of you in the space, and we've got tons of great questions, set up for you to be able to engage with us, but also want to invite the audience as you are listening. And I know given today, a day like today, you perhaps came into the space with questions. So I want to invite you to make use of our Q&A option to be able to share those questions as the conversation moves forward. And I'm already going to go off script. I want to start by really asking our panelists a first question. I'll start with you, Charles, and then want to move. Charles, where do you belong and who do you belong to? Is what I want to know before we get into the questions that are aligned for us. So where do you belong and who do you belong to?
I mean, you really starting off this thing just right. I wasn't even ready. My guard wasn't up. I felt like to protect yourself at all times warning should have come in. We're getting right to it. I think it's just such an important question. And it's one that I think I, like, many of our colleagues on the call and certainly other panelists have to contend with often in higher education, right? As all Black identified folks on the panel, we are constantly trying to make sense of and understand what it means to belong in a place that was not built for us, certainly does not serve us. And I think I can speak for pretty much everyone here, right, that most of where we understand our belonging is in the spaces that we are able to create, right, with ourselves, with our communities outside of the post-secondary environment. And so when I think about belonging, it's definitely deeply related to sort of what I think of in terms of my role in relationship in educational spaces is really as a commitment to everyday Black people, right? So wherever it is that I can find community with everyday Black people, which of course also exists in the university space, is definitely a place in which I feel like I belong. And as that has continued, it's increasingly clear the place that I don't belong, nor do I desire to experience belonging, right? Because I think that raises this question of belonging to what, included in what. And then when I think about those to whom I belong, it's this deep sort of ancestral conversation, right? of the places from whence I come, right? So, and I think about my father, someone who was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama, where we spent most of our summers. And I think about my grandmother, who was born and raised in Kingstree, South Carolina, right? Like these are places that feel immediately familiar just by traversing those highways and byways as I navigate. And so that's the thing that I try to keep sort of with me, right? Is like this place and sense of answerability to those who came before that made possible my even being here. And I think that for me makes me always know that I'm never alone in any of these moments, right? That I walk into these spaces with those folks who are following me, those ancestors that are keeping me guided and keeping me humbled and keeping me grounded. And then of course, elders in the room, right? Elders that we see, that we come into these institutions who have been here for a while, can put us on game and make us feel like we're at home. And I think that those are all really important indicators of how I think about belonging.
Amen and Ashe. Britt, how about you? Where do you belong and who do you belong to?
This is such an interesting question, right? So for me, as a daughter of the Black American South and a proud descendant of stolen and enslaved Africans, I always tell people I belong wherever I am. Any place that I'm making a choice to be is a place that I have made an intentional decision to say that I belong in and that I'm participating in by choice. And so I think choice is a very integral piece of how I think about belonging because often we do things out of survival. We're doing things out of necessity. We work at institutions and we're a part of organizations not because we've made a choice to be a part of them, but because we have to as a condition of our survival. And so for me, where I belong is where I'm making that sort of decision to wake up and go and to be in community with folks. To whom I belong is a more complex question, right? It's the folks who love me unconditionally, the people who say, I see you for who you are. I know who you are. I know what your heart looks like and how that shows up. And I am standing here right beside you, right, wrong, or indifferent. And so that for me is how I think about it. And word to everything that Charles said, right? When we think about our family and sort of the people who keep us here, I'm a first generation college graduate. I'm in rooms and places and spaces that my family has just never conceived of and don't even fully understand, even if I explain it to them, right? Because we make these things unnecessarily complicated sometimes. And they belong because I am here. Wherever I go, they are with me. And so I think of belonging as this sort of communal experience and as something that is deeply tied to the people and places that I value and that I like to center.
Absolutely. And that notion around agency and choice, right? And how you choose to belong and show up in a space, right? But that we're carrying other folks with us as we take up those spaces, I think, is quite profound. Royale, what would you add? Where do you belong, my brother, and who do you belong to?
First, thank you for this question. It's not one that we get to think about and reflect on often, particularly in these kinds of spaces. The first thing that comes to mind is that I am a child of Chicago
Mm.
and the west side of Chicago. That rearing communal experience has been the basis for how I show up in the world, my commitments. I am the son of Mona and Roy and the brother to Raven, my sister. That has been the foundation for how I've constructed and thought about community. It's also been the basis that has animated my professional and personal commitments to my work as a scholar, as a practitioner, as a public intellectual. Those are the communities that have formed the basis for the work that I do.
Well, let's expand upon that, Royale. Talk to us about what it means to belong, particularly in an anti-climate, right? And perhaps what do people get right and what do people get wrong about it in their understanding and practice?
Yeah, first, let me just say it's a pleasure to be in community with literally so many people, almost 300 people on this call. You could be literally anywhere, but appreciate the opportunity to be in community with you all. Belonging or a sense of belonging is a concept that I spend a lot of time thinking about, writing about, and even speaking about. And it's like one of those concepts that have literally infiltrated the higher education lexicon, right? We see it in the same ways that we see student success, engagement, and involvement. It's among those Mount Rushmore of terms that we use in higher education. It's an outcome that so many folks in higher education are concerned with facilitating among community members, but it's also been embraced as a value of institutions of higher education. And interestingly, in this anti-DEI climate, we've seen folks embrace belonging in ways that have been interesting in lieu of DEI, right? So there's a rebranding of DEI in this current moment as anti-American, as divisive, and I have lots of thoughts about that, and we can engage that in the Q&A. But here's what we get right about belonging, right? It is a basic human need. What psychologists would say is that everyone on this Zoom, 250 people, have a fundamental desire to identify spaces, places, and people where we feel deeply connected, valued, and respected. What neuroscientists would say is that it's not just psychological, that the desire to belong is buried deep in the neural and peripheral biological level. That's a fancy way of saying that biologically, we're predisposed to find spaces and places that align with our identities. What they would also say is that the same way in which our bodies process physical pain is the same way in which our bodies process social exclusion and marginalization. It's the same neural activity in our bodies that does so. Here's what we get wrong about belonging. In my work, I have argued that belonging has been too often framed narrowly as an intra and interpersonal phenomenon. And as a result, the implication has been placed on students to find a sense of belonging, right? That we have to normalize the social adversity that students experience and help develop them, enhance their social competencies in ways that enable them to find a sense of belonging on campus. What I've argued is that a more critical ecological approach is necessary that takes a step back and recognizes the ways that institutional policies, practices, and culture coalesce in determining who gets to feel a sense of belonging at this climate in this sort of context, right? That there are practices, policies, ways of doing and knowing that literally conspire and the unbelonging and marginalization that so many minoritized students consistently report on campus when they come. I'll stop there and pause, and uh, yeah, I'll share more thoughts later.
Yeah, no, that's an incredible starting place, though, right? As we think about like, what does the environment allow us to co-construct? Britt sort of brought up this notion of choice, right? And agency and how we name where we belong, right? And choosing to belong wherever we show up. Charles, I want to ask you to take us a little deeper in that direction, right? And think about how do we as individuals sort of exercise this sense of agency and choice and creating a sense of belonging, right? Despite systemic barriers. There's a question in the chat that ties to that as well right now of trying to figure out who we are, that choice and agency shows up. But how can we exercise agency in that way? And what are some effective strategies that you are familiar with for achieving this?
Yeah, so I appreciate what Dr. Johnson had to add from the literatures as we understand sort of this concept. And I want to sort of add on top of that, right, this materialist analysis that takes into account as you're building on the sort of like ecological frame of like the physical ways in which spaces on campus signal, right, who's allowed to be in one space versus who's allowed to be in another space. And also this sort of ways in which policing, right, as a set of practices and relationships makes very clear of who belongs where, right? And when I think about that in terms of what agency is, that we make choices all the time of how we're going to navigate campuses, right? Students especially, but even as faculty, we know like which ways we're going to walk to get to and from our office. We know, right, which events that we may or may not participate in, or if we do, we understand the conditions within which we are expected to show up and participate, often as singular or only sort of voices that are in some of these spaces. And so I think agency is really important of exercising levels of discernment, right, of knowing that like all spaces aren't meant to be spaces for us and certainly are not for us. And what does it mean to have to navigate a certain type of institutional and systemic violence in order to gain entree into those spaces? And, you know, for faculty who are on these calls that are navigating the promotion and tenure process at various levels, understand part of what it means to contort, right? And to have to sort of bend yourself in ways of conforming to maintain and gain access to these other echelons of our profession. And I think for students, not dissimilarly, as they're navigating choices of what student organizations they may become a part of, right? Or what other traditions and social norms that are in place at a particular university they want to partake in an effort to, again, gain sort of efforts and access to being belonging and inclusion. And I think what the literature also tells us, right, is that for racially minoritized students in particular, but also other minoritized groups, that they have so much to sacrifice by trying to gain entree into these places. And once they have, they sort of realize that they're not all of what they're made out to be. right? And so when I think about those strategies, I think discernment becomes really important to sort of understanding and recognizing what are sort of the opportunity costs, right, associated with pursuing belonging and inclusion in spaces that are not designed for you. And are you willing to pay those, right? I think that's also a thing where we can't tell folks whether they should or should not necessarily do a thing, but give them enough information and insight to make an informed decision. Right, we're all members of Black Greek-led organizations on this call, albeit them different, and we needed to sort of understand what the gives and takes of that would be, right? Part of it was sort of this recognition of being able to maintain individuality while also sacrificing aspects of that for the will of the majority as a collective. And knowing that because of tradition, because of history, because of relationships, that was something that we were willing to do. But not dissimilarly, right? We had a sense of agency, right? We came to the informational, right? We chose to submit that application. We chose to undertake our intake processes to gain access. There's so many involuntary choices that happen in college university environments, right? That students are actually restricted from exercising agency and access. And so I think one of those strategies also has to be refusal, right? Sort of refusing what's imposed upon us and told to us about what it means to be successful, what it means to be quote unquote excellent in these particular moments and spaces. And that there's also like a detrimental effect or detrimental impact as a consequence of making some of those choices.
Yeah, I want to invite the panelists if you have reactions or thoughts to that, right? Like, I mean, even acknowledging that we all are, members of Black Greek letter organizations, and there are some moments of discernment and choice that we have made for how we've decided to belong on campus, but, perhaps even reflecting on that latter half, like what are some of the things that you've refused to do, right, in order to maintain or protect your sense of belonging? How might you sort of react or build on what some of that looks like? Do any of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say I made a decision a long time ago that I wasn't going to sacrifice how I show up in my Blackness for anybody, for any place, or for any space. And there have been costs associated with that, right? I've been told to my face that there are institutions that will not hire me because I speak loudly, proudly, and boldly as a Black woman. I've also decided that's a price I'm willing to pay because I don't want to work somewhere that dehumanizes me to a point where you're restricting what I can say and how I show up in a space. And so for me, the politics of refusal looks like I'm not going to be a part of institutions that have made intentional decisions to undermine Black women who are bold enough to say what they mean and mean what they say.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even Charles' comment about contorting that, I remember being a new assistant professor at Penn State, and the senior level faculty who want to take you to lunch and give you unsolicited advice about how to successfully navigate that would require you to make decisions that fundamentally are at odds with your commitments, values, and priorities. And I think students also experience that when they come to higher education to pursue a college degree, right? We still draw on Tinto's widely used retention model that prompts students to integrate, right? We can problematize that notion of integration academically and socially in ways that require them to sever ties with their community. That's the language that he used. That is still the predominant framework that guides institutional practice around retention. And so students who come to higher ed with, fundamentally different ways of knowing, being, expressing themselves culturally are at odds with what the dominant culture is at the institution. And that the message that they get is that in order to be successful, here's what you have to do. I think that is this notion of refusal, as we see students doing that in really beautiful ways, but it continues throughout, undergrad, graduate, and even now as faculty members, that is a constant sort of practice and engagement that we have to think about.
Yeah, and not just a constant practice, right? Something that we've got to grow and mature and learn how to do and pivot with, at different stages, right? What that looks like for students, might be radically different or perhaps the same as you think about that, on the level of a faculty member or a staff member, right? There was the language that Charles used around discernment. I want to carry that forward, right? And really think about as students, faculty, staff are trying to figure out and navigate this sense of belonging and how they exercise choice and agency, right? And how they also, sort of problematize and weaponize the use of refusal in order to maintain that sense of belonging. Like, how do you discern and distinguish between the messages you might be receiving, like as you sort of mentioned, Rayo, right? Those unsolicited sort of moments of like, here is what you need to do. How do you know when that is genuine, right? Or when that might be, something that signals to you, like Britt said, that this might not be a space where folks like you get to thrive. So Britt, actually, I want to invite you to respond to this question about how do we critically assess, right, and distinguish between those genuine efforts to promote belonging and those that are merely perhaps performative, right, or marketing strategies, superficial gestures. Like, how do you engage discernment in their circumstances? What are the tools that you would sort of lift up?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this from a couple of directions, right? And the first one being, do we actually care if it's superficial or genuine, if people are materially benefiting and receiving tangible resources that they actually need, right? Is that not interest convergence 101? And so that said, right, when I'm thinking about that, for me, one of the ways to tease that out is thinking about the difference or sort of distance between espoused values versus enacted values. We can say, right, we have a plan for inclusive excellence or equity or belonging or whatever, but do we actually have structures in place to assess and redress when we don't actually do those things or when we fall short of those things that we have espoused to care about, right? Are we doing those annual or biannual cultural assessments of our institutional climate? What is the process for us to actually look at data when we're talking, about an institutional ombuds office, or we're thinking about an equity office or EEOC or whatever? Like, what does it look like to actually put an audit in place to assess what is actually materially happening on our campuses? And so for me, part of the way you thread that needle is like, we deal with bureaucracy when bureaucracy shows up in those things, right? When those systems undermine our ability to get people what it is that they actually need. And so I'll give you a tiny example, sort of inspired by part of what Charles just said, right? I'm in the tenure and promotion process right now. I went into this very confident. I ain't no ways tired about it, right? And my name is currently misspelled on my tenure and promotion paperwork at my institution. I wrote back, I made a request to correct the spelling of my name, and I was told because of campus policies around documentation submission, blah, 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 whatever the case may be, that they couldn't correct that. Now, whether I feel like I belong at my campus is a discussion between me, my therapist, and God. But any social scientist who's worth their salt, when you hear this incident at face value, you're automatically thinking about, if we can't do something as simple as say someone or spell someone's name right, what are we communicating? James Baldwin, in a letter to my nephew, says that not being allowed to say or spell your name properly is one of the reasons that you might perish. My name is quite literally the most American thing that my parents made me, right? It's the most American thing that they gave me. And so for me, when I think about this, the assessment is falling somewhere in between us thinking about what are the things that we can skip over institutionally? What are the structures and systems that are in place? What does it look like to honor those things and still have shared governance, but also allow us to move in a way that sort of bends the arc of the universe towards justice in a meaningful way for people who are seriously impacted by the way that our systems and structures are, right? We call out institutions, we call out people, we do these things all the time. That might make us feel good, but does it materially change the lives of the folks who are being impacted if there is not actual structural change on the other side of that? Now what? Folks are probably going to shut down. They're going to respond irrationally. What if instead of focusing on that individually, we move that towards accountability? Okay, institution A, you have espoused a commitment and a value to XYZ. You've put that in writing, you've put it on your website, you've trotted it out, you said that these are things that you care about. I am now showing you that on your website on January 22nd at 3:25 p.m., this is a value that you've espoused to have. However, there is a disconnect between that value that you've espoused and the way that X number of people are experiencing your institutional climate, or the way that X number of people are able to engage with your institution or feel like they can be a part of your institution. How are you then going to show me qualitatively, quantitatively in your values and in what you're going to do in response to that? How are you going to change something? And don't just tell me how you're changing it for the majority. Show me your disaggregated data and how you're changing the way people respond to that and how they experience that who are on the margins of the margins. That for me is sort of where those things come together.
Absolutely, right. And I think there's a question in the chat that I want to lift up that sort of ties to this and perhaps either, sort of problematizes this in a way, right? The question on the floor is about your thoughts related to the notion of quote unquote playing the game, right? With institutional barriers, norms, and culture in the context of identity and belonging, right? How does that brush up against what you just named, Britt? Are there ways in which this sort of notion of discernment, and being able to, think about those sort of enacted versus espoused values. Like, is there a playing of the game that is necessary to be able to position yourself in the place to be able to ask for that type of data? And get those receipts that you named, or not? Like, what are your thoughts on that? And then I want to invite both Royale and Charles, if you've got reactions to that too. What might you name?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Black woman first, right? That's the first thing that people see when they see me coming, and I make sure of it because of how I show up, whether it's the hoops or the locks or the whatever, right? So I think for me, part of it is in yes, I'm not gonna sit here and say I don't play the game. That would be disingenuous, right? I play the game to the degree to which I'm comfortable playing it and that aligns with my North Star, and what I've decided is not a line that I'm willing to cross. So for me, I'm not willing to play the game to the degree that I have to undermine or remove or undercut other Black people. I'm never trying to be in a room where I'm the only Black person. I'm not interested. That is not a space that is for me. If there is not already a Black person there, I got questions and I need somebody to answer them quickly, right? So for me, playing the game looks like, what are the things that I need to do to make sure I'm protecting others, that I'm engaging in a way that is communal and that is community centric, that does not take away from other people's ability to survive and thrive, because we're meant to do more than survive. Word to Bettina, right? Like, that for me is what playing the game looks like. It doesn't look like I'm going to make sure I get mine and I'm pulling the ladder up behind me so no one can come behind me. And so part of playing the game in the way I've done it is I am going to make sure, because I am a loudmouth Black woman and I'm perfectly happy being that, that I am going to be undeniable. I went up for tenure as an assistant professor with $2 million in grants and 36 publications. I dare you to deny me, because now you've got to explain how you tenured every mediocre white person that came before me, right? So part of playing the game looks like CYA, cover your ass, make sure you're doing what you need to do and you have your ducks in a row so that you can engage in that resistance. But it also looks like being in community and partnership and collaboration with other people, so you're constantly bringing them along. That for me is my version of playing the game.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I think history tells us that we've always had to be nimble and subversive and even fugitive in ways to push an agenda. We get political windows of opportunity that are rare to usher in material changes that are not often presented. And what we know, that institutions will abandon their priorities as soon as the interests no longer serve them, right? And so when we get these opportunities like 2020, right, we have to be thoughtful, strategic in ways that really lead to material changes, such that when the pendulum swings back, as it's doing now, that we have a stronger foundation and base for which they are attempting to dismantle, right? I'll share advice that my doctoral advisor gave me many years ago when I started my faculty career, is that, not every issue is a stand on the table issue. But when you get to a stand on the table issue, you better be ready to break the table. And I've used that as a compass for how I navigate my faculty career and how I think about self-preservation and trying to fight for every issue and strategizing and building a coalition for folks who can support me so that I'm not solely exhausted from all of this. But that is a strategy that I think about employing and as a strategy for playing the game, such that I'm fortified by the community around me and for folks who are willing to break the table as well.
The only thing I would add, building on both comments, right, is how important it is to make these distinctions between systems and people, right? And not that they aren't related, but I think that often when we see institutions, that we may have good individual experiences because there are individuals within that institution who are taking care of us and looking out for us, which has always been the case, right? This is, I think, what drove many of us to become faculty and staff members who support and invest in Black students, is right, largely because somebody did that for us when we were navigating our institutions. And that's the thing that compels us to do that. But like, let's not be mistaken, right? No matter what any of us do individually to take care of Black students on our campuses, that doesn't mean that our campuses themselves love them any more or any less, right? And I think those distinctions become really important in exercising that discernment of understanding what might be a performative gesture at an institutional level that individuals may carry out if they have, say, a robust infrastructure to support those types of things. But also, as we're seeing in this moment, right, that those things are very fraught categorically in that they can be disregarded, right? These are things that we are currently navigating at the University of Michigan, but other institutions are navigating as well. That, again, when it doesn't serve, right, the interest of power in these moments, at what point are you willing to discard? And I think that also then has to be a cue to what Eddie Cole sort of talks about, of what it means to take up not just the institutional history, but the social history of the institution. Right. And so I think what becomes critically important as we understand this as Black folks and other racial minoritized communities is to think about what is the relationship of the university to the people of color communities and its proximity. Right. Because how it's treated them is a canary in the mine for how it's going to treat you at some point. Right. It's going to treat you as disposable. It's going to try to extract as much as it can from you, right, until you're no longer useful for its capitalist needs. And so I think that becomes a really important thing that, you know, as we're sort of coming into and being included and belong to these places, that we don't misunderstand like how we're positioned in the larger social architecture of the universe. Right. And to do so, to think of ourselves as exceptional, which is a lot of what these places try to bestow upon us, right, as exceptional Negroes, is at the end of the day, the system still sees you as antithetical to its aims and purposes, other than being property, other than it being profitable. And so, as Cornel West would sort of articulate, right, don't get too manicured and deodorized in your discourse that you forget about the funk. And the funk is that question you asked earlier, right, to whom we belong, because that's the place to which we're going to return. When these places go away, whenever that is, right, we're going to have to go somewhere that's called home, right? So we're all got to be able to pull up back in the west side of Chicago, right? We're got to be able to go to Atlanta. I got to be able to go to Tuskegee, right? And we can't go there if we betray those communities because our institutions have compelled us to, right at the moment where they're going to engage in institutional betrayal against us.
Mm-hmm. Mic drop, right? And I think, you know, there are ways, right? As I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about that, right? And I'm also thinking of this language that you used, Royale, around the fortification of community, right? And like, what is it? How do we make sure that we sort of insulate ourselves and that we do got a space to return to, right? That there's this sense of home as we are constantly being displaced, right? We started today with the land acknowledgement. And although we're in a virtual space, I'm clear if you on earth, you somewhere that has displaced, you know, communities, right? And so how are you clear, conscious, and aware of the space that you are taking up and how you belong or don't belong? And what are the ways that you are negotiating that, but both also fortifying yourself, right, with community so that you might both sustain and return and reimagine what community can look like, right? I think we might be in a space even today, right, where we can see that what has existed may well not exist in 90 days, right? And so we're constantly fighting in for and against an institution that wasn't built for us, that hasn't been co-constructed in some ways and in many ways has, and that we are trying to build back, right? So whether you can use the master's tools to, you know, rebuild the master's house is a, you know, a question that's always on the floor. But this notion of fortifying ourselves with community is something that I want to sort of move us forward with. And so, Royale, I want to ask you to sort of build more on that and talk to us about perhaps how smaller communities that share specific identities and experiences can serve as spaces of resistance, right? How does that fortification of community and finding like minds sort of work together? And how can institutions perhaps support these micro ecosystems, if you will, while addressing macro level disconnections?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about it in the context of students, for instance, right, college students, decades of engagement, involvement, research suggests that involvement in affinity groups and organizations, what constitutes a sort of microsystem, are so important for belonging. They're important for identity development and other outcomes that we care about. And so, yeah, we should be investing in these. We should be recognizing them as legitimate and engaging these spaces because for some students, they do constitute counter spaces, right? These are spaces that began to counter the disconfirming messages that students are inundated with when they get to campus about their place, fit, and belonging at the institution. But microsystems alone are insufficient for the kind of transformational change that I think that we're envisioning and talking about, and that Britt sort of alluded to. And right, this requires the critical attention to what campuses do, what they legislate, the culture of our organizations. And, you know, I frame belonging as a institutional responsibility in ways that we have to be attentive to the uneven ways in which students and community members at large experience. And I think so the microsystems are certainly important. They become important counter spaces, but so too are engaging these microsystems to leverage their voices and experience in how we think about decision making and action on campus.
Charles, Britt, you want to react to that?
So I was just going to kind of pick up where I think our next question was headed, but I'll go ahead and yield to Dr. Williams.
You know me, I'm always asking where the money resides. So for me, my immediate sort of question or the thing that emerges for me is how are institutions financially, like intentionally supporting these micro ecosystems that are really creating the sustainability for folks to retain each other. There was an entire book series Sharon Free's Bridget Turner Kelly did talking about we retain each other, right? So if we're doing that work of retaining ourselves and it's benefiting the institution, how is the institution then financially reinvesting into us for us continuing to prop up their numbers, their metrics, their whatevers, and creating the communities that we're doing, which is yes for us, but it also benefits them. And so that's sort of how I'm thinking about this immediately. I think people who are putting together communities, whether they're communities of care, whether they're formal sort of employee resource groups, whatever the case may be, institutions need to financially support those endeavors. And if you're not doing that, are you what are you communicating or what are you saying about the value of that community?
And we're
Because our
seeing they're
money,
not doing it, right?
right?
In Texas, SB 17, the DEI sort of legislation, right? So many of those affinity spaces that otherwise existed for students that constituted these counter spaces, whether it was the Lavender graduation for LGBTQIA students, whether it was the cultural center at public institutions in Texas, they've done away with it. And what I've been inspired by, however, is how private institutions like Rice and others who have opened up their doors and extended their services to recognize how important these counter spaces are for minoritized groups on campus. But to Britt's point, I think, we're seeing institutions abandon and abate their sort of responsibility to attend to things that just 3 years ago they were doubling down on and throwing millions of dollars on. And so again, this is these are these windows of opportunity that we have to really maximize and exploit when we get presented with the opportunity, because otherwise, when interests no longer converge, they will abate responsibility, and then students and communities are left to figure it out themselves.
Yeah, which many students might feel like they're there now, right? That even, here at the University of Michigan, that there are students who are feeling like, we are on our own with this, right? That this investment in co-constructing this space for us, in financially supporting this space, that it was performative. And so given that many students, many people on the call might feel that they are in a space where that right now is truth, Charles, what would you say students can really do to sort of organically create spaces of belonging, right? And what role do these grassroots efforts sort of play in influencing broader institutional practices? Can they push back? Can they speak back? Or does it sort of absolve the institution of responsibility if we create these, or we continue to create these grassroots spaces? What are your thoughts on that?
So it's a complicated issue, right? I think both of what Dr. Johnson and Dr. Williams sort of laid out speaks to both the necessity and also challenges of institutionalization, right? Or what we kind of call in the literature minority absorption. So first, what we have to remember is that much of what has sort of emerged in this particular DEI moment, right? The Black cultural centers, Black studies, like all of these things are the consequence of protests, right? They're the consequence of folks engaging in various levels of camp activism and uprising, right? We know that at least at the University of Michigan, that there were multiple waves of the Black Action movement that made possible, right? Trotter existing, DOS existing, right? Before it being a program now at department level. So all of these things only exist as a consequence, right? We know that power relinquishes sort of nothing without being persisting struggle. And so I think that in part is one, when we think about, again, that institutional history, that the institution doesn't get to rewrite the narrative on how these things came about, right? That it wasn't through their benevolence and kindness and their desire to support Black and other minoritized communities by instituting these things. It's because people, tore shit up. Let's just be completely honest, right? What happened in the late 60s and the 70s, and I always kind of go through this impasse, when I teach my activism and college campus course of like, oh, like people were really outside. Like, yes, baby, they were, right? They were doing things that, when we think about the way the university has responded most recently to the types of actions that students have been taking, right, I have not risen to that same level. So I think that's important just to put into context that all the progressive things that we've seen have been the result of what is probably the most democratic types of practices on campuses. And so what I want to tie in there, right, is that when we think about these micro ecosystems in this sort of like organic way that students are creating belonging, it's really important to remember that like community exists and can't really necessarily be created by an institution or a system, even if it can be supported, right? So what materializes as a Black studies program is because people are engaging in study and struggle outside of the classroom because it wasn't offered, right? That they were having teach-ins, they were having community, learning opportunities. They were meeting in basements of administrative buildings to engage in these reading circles. But then when it becomes institutionalized, and this is the cautionary note, right? Anything an institution, particularly one in a position of power, can give us can always be taken away. So the concern then becomes, through this minority absorption apparatus, is when you have a really progressive Black student movement that's happening on a campus, right? And then that gets institutionalized in some ways between being a Black student union that can actively advocate and engage to a more, democratic student government kind of apparatus, right? Or we can take them the Black student union president and then make them SGA president. What does that mean for losing the political power that we have from the outside because we're so desiring to belong and engage in a particular kind of way that the university can exploit? And so I think that becomes a really critical framing to understanding, like, what does it mean to support this without the fanfare, right? Without the massive headline, without the PR stunt, being able to give those resources where they're needed in order to give students really just their just due, right? Reparations is, sort of part of that conversation as well, without it having to be a thing that says the university is more than what it is. Because again, as we're seeing in this moment, that they can withdraw that support, and then what are you left with when you don't actually have that substantive grassroots support? Part of that idea of rooting, right, is that you can't be moved, right? And when I think about that sort of like old Negro spiritual, right? And we talk about wading in the water, like you have to have roots in order to not be moved. But part of what institutions do is they incentivize your uprooting, right? At present moment, they are incentivizing Black faculty, they are incentivizing Black staff, right? To betray Black students, right? To betray minoritized students. We're seeing it on campuses all over the place. So then what does it sort of mean to think about yourself not to be rooted in community, not to be rooted in a place that really you are answerable to? And for students, as they're navigating these spaces, trying to make sense of themselves, like what they're going to be and become as a process of their matriculation here, I think we have to be good stewards of, right, their sort of like political will and say, like, actually, baby, maybe you don't need to apply for that funding. Maybe there's another way for us to be able to get this money and do what we need to do. Right? Or maybe we don't need to have this meeting on campus because we understand how surveillance culture is working in this moment, right? To sort of be turned against you. And so I think part of it on an institutional level is, of course, recognizing that these places exist, but not this desire, this colonial desire to accumulate them, right? To hold them within bounds, to be able to control and determine sort of how they act, and then use punitive measures like withholding conferrals of degrees and graduation, right? To withhold financial aid, to engage in campus bans and suspensions as a consequence of this activity is really all the things that institutions have consistently done when we look at Black student activism, but are doing absolutely pro-Palestine activism now, consistently done, that just disincentivizes us to engage with that system in a meaningful way because they're not doing so genuinely.
There's a question on the floor that I think ties to what you just named, Charles, that I want to invite you to speak to, and then we're going to get to some of the other questions in the chat as well. But Ashley asked, what can we learn and recreate from the Maroons and Black Wall Street to disengage from these systems altogether and start our own liberated practices and ways of living? What would you say in response to that?
I mean, we got to be willing to risk and relinquish, right? Like, this is my thing. We talk big games in these papers and these presentations, even on these calls like this, right? But like, what are you willing to give up in service of this work? And I think as I talk about maroonage and fugitive engaging activity, that so much of that is stuff that cannot and really should not be made legible to the institution, right? So as faculty, I think about all the things that we do that never make it to the CV, right? Or if it does, we've got to like reconfigure how we talk about what this is, like publicly engaged work, so that it can be legible and valuable. And part of what I think we have to understand from maroonish communities, right, is that so much of what had to happen had to proceed in the dark, right? When Harriet had to pick folks up and get them free, she didn't come in the daytime, right? She came at night. And so part of it is understand the cover of darkness provides a certain level of insularity, a certain level of obscurity, so the institution cannot then understand fully what is happening and what's going on, right? Everything need not be a institution-wide DEI initiative, nor does what it is that we're doing need to be framed in that particular context, because as we know, DEI is a necessary but insufficient condition for a pro-Black environment. So I think it becomes really important to say, am I willing to give up the prestige, the profit, the productivity associated with whatever it is in my job function at the university, right? Or if I'm a student, right, that high profile sort of, notoriety within campuses, certain letters of recommendation, perhaps, that often are held over people's head. What am I willing to give up? Right? Because if we can't give up anything, then we're as much a part of the problem as we imagine ourselves to be a part of the solution. And I think that's a really, really important thing for us to think about, because all the institutions at which we are navigating try to confer prestige as this like capital exchange, right? They're like, I'm gonna give you some notoriety, some recognition, a platform, but in exchange, you got to give me something. And what they're asking us to give up is something that can never be replaced. Right. So I think we have to be really thoughtful and responsive of knowing what those limits are, which ways we are willing to move and not move, And also say like, that's actually not a thing that I'm willing to do, right? All money ain't good money and all recognition ain't good recognition. So we got to be willing to give something up if we're really committed to this work.
I'll just emphasize that most people aren't honest with themselves about that the reward system is so seductive and prestigious such that folks are not honest, that they're not willing to give up so much of that. And even us being at particular kinds of institutions have negotiated a degree of that as well. And in terms of to be at the places that we're at. And I just wish people were more honest about their sort of willingness or lack thereof.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that I don't need public credit for everything that I do, right? And so part of disentangling some of what, Charles and Royale are saying, I think ties into the fact that institutions are counting on us wanting to receive credit for every little thing, wanting us to document every little thing. One of the constant things I'm talking to my students about is that you don't need documentation or phones or whatever to show that you did something. Sometimes just doing the thing. And when you get together with your group of folks and you're like, remember that time when we did XYZ, that is more than enough. You don't always need evidence of what it is that you've done and what it is that you're doing. And you definitely don't always need credit for it, because that is how we're able to do things under the cover of darkness, and how we're able to sort of continue these things going forward.
Yeah, and while there is certainly, right, this system of rewards, there's also this system of reprimand, right? And so we know that sometimes being able to do things in the subversive also, helps us to evade the types of punishments that keeps us from being in positions of power that really allow us to disrupt these patterns of inequity that cause us into these spaces in the first place, right? And there's a couple of questions in the chat to sort of speak to people trying to figure out, like, how do I find my footing and grounding in space where I'm, sort of in a middle management role, right? Where I'm trying to find a sense of belonging, but trying to, sort of broach that in a way, that feels safe, right? In terms of management. And so, Britt, I want to ask you, because many of the folks who are on this call, right? I mean, we're at 264 people right now. There's a significant amount of those folks who are working in environments where attempting to correct some of these inequities might lead to reprimands that really have consequences for individuals or for their units, right? It's not just about the reprimand for them, but for their unit. And so how can we continue to do this work in meaningful ways and take care of ourselves? And perhaps what advice would you give to some of those folks that are struggling to feel a sense of belonging within an office space, or who are trying to broach this issue of belonging in a way that sort of advocates for this office-wide change, as Zach is asking about?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So I always think about things in terms of what is my North Star, and what is sort of the ultimate reason and rationale for why I'm doing what I'm doing. I also think a lot about what Dominique Baker said at AERA a couple of years ago when she received her AERA award. And she said, I asked my husband if he would still love me if I didn't get tenure. And once he said yes, of course, nothing else mattered. Right. And so that for me uniquely ties into how I'm thinking about, or how I want us to think about, what an institution can actually take away from us, right? What is it that I'm willing to give up? And what is it that I'm willing to be reprimanded for? I think if we're having a conversation about what's on the right side of justice, right? And a key thing I think we need to think about within this is what we're doing to collectively support one another when people are making that decision that this is their North Star and they're not backing off this thing. We know that folks are being reprimanded and fired and harassed and harangued for saying free Palestine. What are we doing as a larger collective to say, this is how we're going to protect those folks? An easy way we can do some of that is through mutual aid. What are we doing for people who are laying it all on the line? How are we sort of putting together financial care packages and resources and infrastructure and support so that when people say these are things that they value and we agree with them, even if we're not in the position to say that publicly for whatever reason, right? People have children, people have bills, people have whatever. I understand all of those things. But what is it that we're doing if we are deciding that we are going to be quiet and remain a part of the system and sort of upholding what the system is saying? How are we then supporting the folks who are going to lay it on the line for us? All of these movements and all of these things that happen, they have to happen through community care and through collective action. I think the other piece of it, right? I think a lot about Texas and sort of the bill that sort of Royale was talking about, right? In theory, right? Theoretically, DEI is banned in Texas, but there's also a loophole where they can accept money for DEI initiatives if it's coming from private funders, if it's coming from the federal government, if it's coming from whatever. Why? Because greed trumps everything. And so if we hold that to be the reality, then we need to think about how we can be greedy ourselves, how we can organize ourselves, how we can sort of redistribute wealth ourselves and among ourselves so that those who are making decisions as part of this movement do not feel like they're engaging in resistance by themselves. Dr. TJ Stewart and I talk about resistance as a matrix. There are going to be folks who are going to say, I'm down for getting fired. There are going to be folks who are going to say that they're not. Okay, how do we make space for the gamut of those folks and sort of the matrix of where people are falling on those lines? And then are we actually giving them the resources they need once it actually happens? I think the other piece of this is we need to think about when it's not worth it no more. I think a lot about Claudine Gay, Joanne Epps, Antoinette Candia Bailey, like all of these folks who were publicly humiliated, who lost their lives, who were bullied or pushed out of their jobs. At some point, we need to think about when and where we enter. Word to Paula Giddings, right? If this is a system that is going to take so much from us that we might lose our lives, that we might lose our health, that we might lose our sense of self, maybe it's time for us to decide to be a part of another system or to think about moving within the system in and of itself. That can look like changing jobs. It could look like changing institutions. It could look like saying, I'm leaving academia altogether, right? Because part of what we are tending with and what's showing up in our bodies is institutional betrayal. I write about this when I talk about how Black women experience the highest sort of rates of what doctors call allostatic load or the stress hormone, how we measure that, right? Black women have the highest levels of stress writ large of any demographic in the United States of America. That is amplified in places like these institutions that are constantly trying to upend and undermine and displace and hurt us. And so I think one of the ways we sort of navigate some of that is through that mutual aid, is through making a decision about whether we're going to stay or whether we're going to go. And then us collectively deciding to treat this like a relay race. If Charles is tired of fighting for XYZ thing, and he's exhausted, but I agree with the thing that he's fighting for, pass me the baton, let me fight this fight. And you know what? You can go fight this other one that I've been on the front lines for and I've gone exasperated with, right? This needs to be an intentional and collective effort of things that we're doing. Right now, we're disjointed and we're siloed, and the only people benefiting from that are the institutions themselves. We are spending so much time arguing semantics, we're arguing the how, that we're not focused on the what, which is the end goal. And that is what we're trying to get to. And so I think those are some ways that we can sort of think about how to do this meaningfully and care for ourselves. Is also in caring for each other. I can't say I'm only focused on caring for myself if I'm not worried about how my colleagues are also experiencing the same kinds of violence that I am.
So I would just add that some of it is about tempering your expectations for the likelihood of transformational change. And if I'm channeling Derek Bell, progenitor of CRT, one of the first tenets of CRT is the permanence of racism. And that's a hard pill for folks to swallow and wrap their mind around, especially when they're working within their sphere of influence and are really committed and animated about a particular change. But what he argues is that part of that recognition is how we begin to sort of cope and temper our expectations such that we're not surprised with the ways in which white supremacy sort of recreate itself. And so you still work within your sphere of influence to enact material changes as far as you can. And part of that is the coalition building and the strategy. It's also holding people accountable who say they care about us. And I give you a quick example. When I was a new assistant professor at Penn State, I had a white faculty mentor who I really like and we're really great friends to this day, but who missed the opportunity to support me publicly when in sort of situation arise where a student was being really inappropriate and I presented it in a faculty meeting. The faculty sort of brushed over it and she came up to me afterwards and said, "Hey, I noticed this happened. I'm really sorry." And I said, "Nope, you missed the opportunity to do it publicly. Don't apologize privately, right?" And so there was a managing up that I had to do in helping her understand what it looked like to support and show up for me and be in community with me if you say that you care about me. And so part of that is recognizing your own sort of positional power within this sort of matrix and system and being in community with others who are positioned more powerfully to sort of be in community with you and advocate in ways that you perhaps cannot or that are less, less risky. And so I use it as an example of ways in which I think we also have to hold people accountable for those who purport to care about us. And she received it in a really amazing way and has been outrageously supportive in ways that I couldn't have imagined.
I love that, right? I mean, and I think this notion, right, of managing up, right, I think is also one to keep in mind as we think about belonging, right? There was a question a few minutes ago that I want to put on the floor to the panelists that comes from a guest who's asking for advice as it pertains to transgender students and scholars who might struggle to feel a sense of belonging in the classroom or on campus, etc. Such as when, people are refusing to acknowledge your pronouns or etc. And I think this notion of managing up and managing out and how much we're teaching folks how to treat us and create space is often one that comes up when we talk about or think about belonging. And so I want to invite the panelists to react to this question and share what advice you might give to this participant, but also to build on this notion of like, what does the managing up look like? Should we be taking and putting energy towards making sure folks know how to care for us as we are caring for ourselves? How much of that becomes our responsibility as we are finding and disrupting spaces where we ought to belong? So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think I'm challenged by the sort of managing up construct. And one, because it obviously identifies a power differential, right? It's the person on the underside of power having to manage someone at the the higher side of power. And I think there's one way of thinking about that for ourselves, which is really about our perseverance and survival, right? So it's a requirement in order for us to survive these spaces to manage up, right? But what I actually am most concerned about is not people's ability to manage up, because we've always done this, right? All marginalized groups have had to manage up for their survival. I'm most concerned about managing horizontally, right? Because what Dr. Johnson just mentioned is that you have a colleague that sends you an email after the meeting or pulls you aside but says nothing in the actual space that exists and happens, right? And so when I think about this particular moment, for our trans siblings and sort of how they're being positioned, right, when it's articulated on a national stage, right, that the only two genders that we recognize, albeit that they were talking about biological and anatomical sex to begin with, we're not going to get into all, again, the semantics of what people do not understand about gender, right, is understanding how that then will be interpreted at your place of work, how it will be interpreted in your community and the institutions you reside in. And as a cis person, what does it mean to intercede on the types of violences that then those folks will be subject to, whether in their presence or their absence, right? And when I think about that horizontal sort of management, it's saying like, in what ways am I in a pretty much similar power position as an individual who's engaging in some of this types of harm? Right. And what does it mean to speak up and to intercede? Too often we put ahead of people these other things that, again, are incentivizing us, right? Profits, whether that's the job, the prestige, the productivity, all of these things we put ahead of actual people's, day-to-day living and well-being. And we refuse to intercede because we know it's going to cost us something, right? Without recognizing what it costs this other person to have to navigate this terrain, right? And all things that are going to be foreclosed. So when you're sitting in these meetings, which you have privy that other folks don't, right? Like, what are you going to do in that moment when a policy is put down, right? Or someone's being obtuse about what can or cannot happen with this preemptive compliance for policies that may or may not exist, right? Like, we need to look at what the record is going to say. And I think this becomes really important as we're thinking about sort of this, long continuum on which we exist in time as but markers within this longer political struggle, is in this moment, right? 10, 15, 20 years from now, what are you going to be able to say about what you did and where you were and who you were as a response to the conditions that were put upon you, right? We know what our mamas and our daddies can say about where they were, right, in this sort of previous periods. I got to answer to my children in 20 years about, Daddy, what was you doing when all this stuff happened during the first and second Trump presidency? And I can say with conviction what I know I did, right? And part of that did cost me stuff. It's cost me a lot of things as a consequence of the things I've taken up in my career. But to Brittany's point, those are things I was willing to lose, because what I didn't lose is people, right? And I know to be true that all of these things are interconnected. And so, I'll kind of close with, as we're vacillating in this sort of afterlife of Black Lives Matter sort of pro forma, right, that we always understood that all Black lives were critically important, and that when our Black trans siblings were being attacked in these particular ways, right, that also was an indictment of what it meant to think about Black personhood in the ways that we have also reinforced these particular boundaries, right? I saw a post that I think a lot of folks have reposted and treated, right, that like, a world without trans people has never existed. So it damn sure is not going to start now. But our ability to actually, maintain what some of the protections that we've been able to get and also fight for those things, right, is coming down to what's going to happen in these next several months, within these 100 days, but also in the next subsequent years, right? There's nothing that prevents you from doing the right thing, even if it feels like it's at the wrong time, right? Because that has to be a battle we're willing to fight. And I promise you, if we take it up, there's going to be more people that are willing to fight that with us, right? It's never an individualized exercise, but we have a responsibility and an obligation to stand in those positions of power and to confront those with whom we are parallel, to not allow for injustice to persist.
In this season too, right, of everything that's going on, I think being able to find, how do I want to name this? Being able to find critically conscious language that allows us to speak to and name what we're doing, but to also hide in plain sight, right? I mean, we've sort of had this conversation, you know, today, and it's sort of come up, right? This no more of like things that need to be done in the dark, right? What are those things that need to be perhaps subversive? They are part of the sort of underground railroad movement, so to speak, of moving this work forward, being able to start fires on campus and not smell like smoke, those sort of notions. So there's this question on the floor that I want to pose to the three of you, and Rael, perhaps you can start, is about what are some of the strategies, or that's not the language. The question is about well, yeah, so strategies that you would offer for offices and departments that are preparing or perhaps have already pivoted to transition language away from what is synonymous with DEI, perhaps trying to shift to belonging, or some folks are even shifting away from this notion of belonging in ways that can be assessed, right? And so what are your thoughts on that? What are some strategies that you might offer, or perhaps even reactions you have to folks that are choosing to pivot away from that language, even when legislation or, you know, particular pressures haven't come down, that there's this anticipation that it will. So there's this sort of pre-pivot happening. So perhaps what are
Yeah.
your reactions to that, and what are some strategies that you would advance for folks who might find themselves in that space right now?
Yeah, it's a question that I get a lot and one that I've been engaging with folks about. And I had a conversation with a mentor, James Banks, who is the sort of father of multicultural education. And what he would say in the 80s is that multiculturalism has always been anti-racist and equity minded and oriented, but that was the language of the moment that was palatable, that allowed an agenda to move forward in ways in which it would not have, right? And so, to one extent, you know, we've always had to be nimble and thoughtful about language that we use in particular moments to do the work that we care about, whether it's called DEI, whether it's called multiculturalism or belonging. Now, I also recognize the power and importance and the precision of language and naming particular phenomenon, right? That there's value in naming anti-blackness as a particular form of oppression over racism, you know, just sort of blanket. Um, you know, I think there's a chilling effect that is happening, and that many institutions are preemptively abating their prior commitments, perhaps erroneously and not needed. But I also know that there are some contexts in which the vast majority of folks can't get around the name of DEI because it has been intentionally branded by bad actors in ways that people can't support. But if you look at national polling data, the vast majority of Americans support the principles and foundations of DEI. When you ask them whether or not they support targeted supports for minoritized communities around first generation, low income students, they support it. They support federal involvement. So what is it about the name and branding of it? I think in some contexts, DEI has been the too much has been lost and how we've branded it, and that we have to be nimble in what we name things. And I actually don't think it's a horrible thing that folks have embraced belonging. I think it have been and always a critical way in which folks can carry out belonging work in ways that attend to. In fact, I think belonging cuts across DEI, that if DEI is sort of the moniker, that belonging is the through line forward. And so in some contexts, I encourage folks to embrace it. But here's how you do the work. I care less about what you call it, but more about what you do, what's under the hood. And I don't know that folks are spending enough time thinking about how do they still carry out this work in transformational ways that are legal and sort of allowable from the law, that sort of respect their institutional missions and priorities, and not sort of preemptively abating their responsibility because of out of fear of legality. And we also need to be concerned about the folks suing on the other side. Is that what happens when you create workplace conditions and environments that are discriminatory against folks because it's not diverse, it's not inclusive, it's not equitable, that's a legal liability that we also aren't attending to.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question that I want to add to this. Dina, I believe, is a guest who's on the call who is not a member of a university or an alum. but considers themselves a part of the larger community. They are asking for advice on how we can exert pressure in this space, or are we needed to build out the support network? Or is there something else? Like, what would you say to folks who are on this call who are don't consider themselves a part of academia, right? They're not in the ivory tower. What pressure could they exert on that space, or what's needed in order to sort of continue this sort of notion of belonging both in a place, not of a place, etc., as we sort of been naming today? What are your thoughts on that? Brittany, I see your wheels turning, Britt. So tell me what you're thinking.
I'm thinking about this, but I'm also thinking about that last question, right? And my immediate sort of thought is do not preemptively comply. That's like the very first thing that comes to mind. I think part of what we're doing is we're acquiescing to something and we're allowing a very small number of people to redefine what a lot of larger concepts actually mean and how we have sort of navigated what those things mean. And we're allowing them to shift that language in a way that is intentionally in bad faith. And so I'm thinking right now a lot about D.L. Stewart and his point about the need to move away from diversity language anyway, because it's a language of appeasement and we need to be moving towards a language of justice instead, and what it might look like. And part of that is sometimes we need to be an island of one. And so when I think about what folks from the outside can do, they can help us sort of force these institutions to think about the fact that you can't make a space that's inhospitable become a space of belonging without fundamentally changing that space to begin with. Right? You can't have belonging, even if you're just trying to sort of rename or whatever, if you're not thinking about how people actually experience the environment. And so structural inequality undermines the ability for us to actually create belonging. We have to address the structural inequities that people are facing. And I think members of our community are particularly positioned to help us do that because the institution cannot engage in retribution towards them in the same way that it can engage in retribution towards those of us who are beholden to the institution, whether it's for a paycheck, whether it's for a degree, or it's for a transcript. Right? How many students' transcripts are being held hostage because they said free Palestine a semester ago? A whole lot. And how many do we not know about? And what are we actually going to do about it? We need community members to say, hey, there's something wrong with this, and this is how I think you all should address this, or this is what I need you to be doing differently, right? We need to be having these conversations so it's not just about, oh, how do I want to say this? So it's not just about like a conversation of equity or belonging. We need to be thinking about, structurally, dialectically, that's the word I'm looking for, right? It's a both and. We're thinking about both of these things concurrently at the same time and how they're sort of interconnected with each other because they have to coexist. If the federal government just disbanded DEI and put all of these people on leave and upended, the executive order that requires equal employment opportunities in government contracting, that literally means that the federal government has said that it can discriminate in its hiring practices. What are our institutions then going to say in response to that? What are community members demanding that our institutions say in response to that? Because it's a little bit easier for us to get closer to these institutions in our communities and our neighborhoods than it's easy to get to the federal government if you're outside of DC. Right. And so, how do we use geographical positioning and proximity and location to our advantage to be able to say, this is what we want to hold you accountable for? If our institutions are not already thinking about how we engage in that protection of people who do equity work, of people who are centering equity work, of people who look like the face of equity, because that's really what this conversation is about, right? We can keep naming it something else. This is really about who looks like DEI. Then let's be honest, we can't really talk about a culture of belonging because we haven't addressed the thing in the room that we're actually talking about in and of itself. And so I think for me, it is vital to do that if for no other reason than on Monday we celebrated MLK Day and on Tuesday we let a bunch of people get fired or almost fired or on the way to fired because they are standing on principles and values that we're talking about on this call.
I guess one of the questions on the floor too becomes, how do you find the courage, right? I think that there are folks on the call, perhaps even maybe some of us, right, who might be losing hope and seeing the ways that people are pivoting, the way universities are rolling things back, whether something legislatively has come down or not, right? Looking at what you just named in terms of the decision that the federal government, has made, right, and taking this position. How do you find the courage to sort of complement the discernment, right, of knowing, okay, this is what it is, this is what I'm fighting for, but how do I, in this moment, sort of find the energy that I need, the wherewithal, to be able to take on and take that position, perhaps, and to think about that courage both as an individual, but also as a unit, as a collective, right? What does it look like for an institution to stand on business, right? How do you find the courage to do that? What would you say, right? Like, where does your courage come from in doing this work and showing up the way you're showing up today on January 22nd, 2025, given what's at stake? And then what would you say to others who are perhaps looking for or trying to engineer that courage in their place of work? What is your advice there?
So I think my immediate response, one, is we have to be willing to refuse this deep American value and investment in individualism, right? Courage cannot be exercised at an individual level ever, even if history would like to suggest, right? And when I say that, I mean history, capital H, which is white historians revising how we understand and interpret the things that happened in the past, right? That in recognition of what we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day, right? That like King is not an individual charismatic figure that made all things possible, right? If not for the parishioners and churchgoers, if not for Coretta, right? If not for so many other folks that created space, if not for the antagonistic positioning of Malcolm against King, did any of these things actually happen? And so part of it is to know that exercising moral and political courage requires community. And this is, I think, why we're seeing such a dearth of moral and political courage at these institutions and at organizations, is because they're simply not in community, right? They've been led to believe that as individuals, right, that through their individual merit, which we also can and should interrogate, right, through their own individual efforts, that have become sort of ascending to this particular mountaintop, not thinking about all the systems and structures that were in place that made possible their ascension. And so I think part of it is, and a thing that I talked to my students in the wake of the election, was that if you don't have a political home, you need to get one, right? And that can be in a formal organization sense with, some of the things that we're all affiliated with, but also in an informal sense when we talk about that legibility and recognition, right, of what does it mean to be engaged in political discourse and political learning, right, with a community of people that have shared interest in making the world a better place. And that becomes so important because then you recognize that even if you maybe individually are exercising courage in a space, that there are other people that are in that political community similarly exercising, right, that political and moral courage in the spaces that they're able to occupy as well. And I think it ties into Dina's question about sort of the role of community sort of generally in this, right? And I think part of it is to also then recognize both inside the university and outside of the university, that the university is not the domain of solutions, right? That it in fact is the domain and the progenitor of many of societal's problems. We know that universities in fact are one of the longest standing vestiges of colonial dispossession and systematic racism in this country. So what does it mean to actually frame the university against what it sees itself as, right? And in doing so, not yielding then the things the university constantly wants to exchange, right, through these market-like behaviors, right? Part of what universities sort of wield in their economy is that they're the primary job providers, right? That they are people that create wealth for a community despite extracting that wealth almost instantaneously. And so when we have to question then, what does it mean for a single organization to be the primary job provider, healthcare provider, landlord in many cases and instances, and what are we willing to no longer yield, right? That destroys our communities and our capacity for political self-determination, that would create more of a support for us to actually engage in that moral and political courage. And I think we also then lastly need to understand, right, what courage actually is, right? Courage to me is the exercise of bravery in the face of the uncertainty and the almost imminent threat, right, that's being imposed upon you by an organization or institution. Because the reality is right, right? Our grandmamas taught us there ain't no right way to do the wrong thing. So what does it mean to actually, as you said, stand on business in the face of that uncertainty, in the face of that precarity? Because again, this is the only thing that we're actually going to have, right, at the end of the day. If we can only show, when it's all said and done, if all we have to show for ourselves is that we got these jobs, right, that we have so been brilliantly trained and prepared for, right, and we have nothing else of substance that we can actually rely upon, what do we actually have to give to generations that came before us? And I think part of when we're talking about drawing that courage and that strength is to look at the history, right? That there are people who had to exercise moral and political courage for us to even be here, for us to even survive, for us even to have place, to have home, to have resources. And so we have an obligation, not, and going back to this individualism comment, not to self-serve, right, to have our own interest to advance, right? We should be all fighting for changes in the world that we will not see in our lifetime, because we want our children to grow up in a better situation. That doesn't mean it won't be challenging. It won't be, as Dr. Johnson said, racism permutating itself in a way that they will have to fight their own fight. But there is something that we can and should do now that outlives us, right? Because that's what legacy is about. So when we talk about the legacies that we're all inheriting, what is the legacy that we're leaving for our children and our grandchildren to inherit, and how are they going to remember who we were in this moment and in this time? If I'm not courageous now, I can't expect my baby to be courageous in 15 to 20 years, right? I can't expect them to be courageous tomorrow. right? And so I think part of it is just thinking outside of that individualized frame, right? Going back to the Ubuntu sense of self, right? That I am because we are, right? If I see myself as this broader collective, then I know that not only I, but Britt, but Royale, but Kyra, we all have a responsibility to each other, right? To exercise courage in the face of fear and uncertainty.
And if you're waiting on tenure to be courageous, it won't happen. It won't. If you're waiting for that special moment where you feel even more protected, I mean, there are people who are losing tenure all the time. Even we've seen that in the last couple of years, but tenure won't protect you either.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, right? Who you are before tenure is who you are after. And so for me, I decided a long time ago that there is space for my gifts, for my talents. These are things that were given to me that no institution can ever take from me, even if they have helped me to hone those things. And it wasn't the institution that did that, it was the people who make up the institution that did that for me. And so I think it, in terms of words of encouragement and things that I'm thinking about, is that there's space in the movement for all of us, and we all need to be collectively working towards something, and we need to figure out what those collective actions are going to be. We have to get on some common ground and figure out how to align ourselves together, because I think what is happening, particularly, I'll be very honest, on the far right, that we are very bad at, those of us who are not on the far right, is being in alignment with ourselves, with each other, and standing together on things. We spend so much time trying to feel like we're pushing a particular issue forward, a particular thing has to take up center stage, a particular thing has to be talked about in this particular way, that we are spending so much on semantics that we're losing the value and the substance of the what that we're doing. And so I think for me, my word of encouragement is that this is a long fight. It's always been a long fight. There has been no moment in American history where things have been easy. It just, there literally is no moment where that has ever existed. And so I think if we move away from this idea of things were better in this moment, or things were okay in this moment, or it was easier, or it was whatever, we can actually get to the place of doing something about what is happening right now by looking at the lessons from the fights that happened before us. Those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. And so we need to be actually listening to and studying up on and being intentional about how we are passing those histories down. Who are the folks that are going to be griots and sort of knowledge producers and knowledge transfers to the folks who are coming up who don't know these things, because it has been institutionally advantageous for them not to learn it. That is what I think is in the affirmation. It is in us sharing the knowledge, and us creating the space for the knowledge sharing, and in us being collaborative and community centered, even in the face of institutions telling us that we are in odds or in competition with each other, because I fundamentally disagree with that. I've applied for jobs that I knew I had no intention of ever taking because my friend really wanted it and I was going to get the interview questions for them, not because I wanted to be at that institution. So what are the ways that we are going to circle back to that question about playing the game, going to engage each other and be intentional for one another so that we can then collectively engage in resistance together?
Another question that I want to ask you all before we shift, we're almost at our closing. But I'm curious because I know folks who are doing this work, who have been doing this work, who've had skin in the game, who are, sort of upvoting, and we've seen a lot of upvotes to what you all have been naming. Finding a source of hope, finding courage, and being able to maintain a dream can be difficult. Sometimes when you are so focused on the problem, the love for the fight sometimes can become bigger than the hope for the dream of what you are trying to manifest. And so it might be helpful for some folks to even hear what your dream is, right? We know what the problems are. And we've been talking about ways in which we discover, rediscover, reclaim, dismantle, disrupt these sort of notions of belonging. But belonging for what purpose, right? So what is your dream? What are you hoping to manifest, right? Whether it's in your lifetime or, Charles, as you've mentioned, when our kids are elders, right? What do you hope? What is your dream for what these spaces look like? Can you name that? Can you give people a picture of what that might include? Like what does that look like for you?
You don't hit us with the tell us about your dream, Martin.
Come on, imagine futures.
look, we still imagine it's a process, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's an important one, for folks who haven't read Ruha Benjamin's Imagination Manifesto. It's an important notion, right, that we've got to protect our capacity to dream.
Yes.
Sometimes we fighting so much, once the fight is over, we just start fighting again, right? Because we don't imagine the world we want to be in. And so I want to, drop that in a space, right, as an opportunity and an entry point for hope. To even problematize the notion of hope, perhaps, but to give people an idea to cling to, right? Something to begin to imagine, as what you see on the news or what you see on your campus might be disheartening. There might be, something else to cling to. So I'd love to, open up the space for that.
Yeah, I mean, imagination is so important, right? And Robin D.G. Kelly writes about this in the seminal text Freedom Dreams. And part of his articulation is that, imagination is critically important, because without imagination, we only know what to destroy and not what to build. Right. And so I think centering this idea of world making, which is tying back into sort of a discourse of abolition, right, is the thing that I kind of sit with, given that's where my work has been over the last several years. And I, I want to uplift your work, Kyra, of centering, joy, right, as sort of restorative and like a healing practice, and things that we can create also in maroonage spaces, right? When we understand, the ways in which insurrection happened, it wasn't just the need for violence to combat violence and slave revolts, but also the creation of joy, right, and the celebration of life, despite dealing, in death, as the institution of slavery often did. So, when I think about, aspects of what it is that I'm dreaming, of course, principally as a higher education scholar and an educator, like I want to imagine that we exist in a world in which educational institutions are life affirming and not death dealing, right? That they're actually in the business of spirit, development, and not spirit murdering, that is so often seen and experienced by us. And so what does it mean to think about, life affirmation, right? Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition, not about absence, but about presence, and specifically the presence of life affirming institutions. And so if higher education itself is a progenitor of those problems, despite espousing itself to be a solution, like what does it mean to actually reverse course on all the ways in which it engages in interpersonal and systemic harm, right? And specifically in the context of, the post-secondary project, think about all the things that it's built itself upon. We look at Black student debt as an example, and want to uplift Jonathan Davis and Jill Mustafa Bishop's work, as well as a number of other folks working on that project, of what did it mean to be included and belong to institutions that ultimately put us in racialized debt traps, that entering into racist, sexist labor markets, we can never pay off our debt, even by comparison to our white counterparts who are paying it off exemplary, significant more rates, obviously accumulating less debt in that particular process. What have we been included and belonged to? And so some version of an abolitionist higher education would have to rid itself of this debt-making mechanism that ultimately is not paying the dividends that we were suggested it to be paid, right? It also means that we are not constantly committed to decimating and extracting from neighborhoods and communities the things that institutions want for themselves that leave institutions at a falter, right? What does it mean for the University of Michigan to operate a campus in Flint and Flint still not have clean water, despite being one of the biggest political apparatuses in the state, right? And so when I think about that life affirmation, right, it's that we, again, are prioritizing people over productivity, prestige, and profit. And if that fundamental paradigm can't actually shift, right, I don't know that that dream can actually become true. And so then to Britt's point, this is a conversation her and I for sure have often via text, where I was like, baby, I don't know how much longer I can be here, right? Because I can only deal with so much death dealing and spirit murdering, right? Because part of the longstanding and longevity of my ability in these institutions is to socialize me away from, not a relationship with Black people. That's not the price that I'm willing to pay. And so if higher education is to exist, and more, specifically if I'm to exist in it, it's got to be a space of life affirmation, right? And I'll sort of close with, to be more clear, that not all post-secondary institutions function in those same ways. We know that our open access institutions, right, many of our minority serving HBCUs and predominantly Black institutions, right, are doing a different type of service capacity that's providing life affirmation, life affirming possibilities for people that may not exist in your predominantly white institutional context or your research, intensive institutions. So we have examples of how these things are working because they're attending to the material needs of those communities, right? They're providing certificate programs and jobs and pathways and other things like that that are critically important. So what does it mean to just have a different set of currencies and things we value as important, and people being chief among them? And that's the higher education of my dreams.
Britt, you got thoughts you want to add to that?
I love that. I mean, No, listening to Charles is making me think about my friend Dolan, who recently did their dissertation out of the University of Vermont on non-binary and BIPOC students' freedom dreams and how they try to create new worlds and engage in that world making. And one of the things I remember as I read part of this dissertation was thinking about how much the students are really struggling to do that envisioning because so many horrible things are happening to them concurrently and continuously all the time at the hands of our institution, at the hands of our government, at the hands of people who are parallel and sort of peers and peer networks to them. And so when I'm thinking about what a future of higher education should look like, it needs to look like a world where necropolitics are not the way that we engage in decision making about who and whose lives and experiences and quite frankly beings actually matter, where we're not engaging in institutions that are reflective of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Word to bell hooks, right? It looks like joy, it looks like health, it looks like freedom, and it looks like, for me, Black women quite literally and figuratively thriving rather than dying to go to work. And so I think of a future of higher education where we're not fighting the same battles and fighting the same wars and regaining the same gains over and over again, because that process is a distraction away from our ability to even dream up these future sort of possibilities and these imagined worlds where these things can actually exist.
Mhm. Yep, and I think it behooves us, right, as we try to protect our notions of belonging, right, to make sure that there's space for our dreams to belong as well, right, that you've got enough courage, that you've got enough discernment, that you've got the sort of insulation of community, right? To be able to fortify yourself in a way that protects your capacity to dream, right? And if you're not connected to that, that you get connected to that, that there's hopefully something that you heard from our panelists today that disrupts perhaps a safer notion of belonging, right? That is just about being in the space and perhaps not being of the space, but to take that to an even deeper level, right? Of disrupting that space in a way that allows you to create something anew. Right. And that creation of something new does not just repeat the sins of the past, right? That it doesn't just put forth our own version of capitalistic, colonizing technologies, right? That we can disrupt those patterns enough that we don't inherit that same inclusion bureaucracy and move that forward in a way that puts us as the people in power, right? But that we can disrupt altogether those notions of power as we move forward, right? So hopefully something that you've heard related to belonging today gives you the courage to really step into that, in a new and in a different way. I want to invite Edmund, who's going to do our closing for today, but I want to thank the three of you really for being vulnerable, for being transparent, and for positing into this space on a day like this, opportunities for folks to not just be affirmed in what they're doing, but to also be encouraged to do all the more and to do that in a way that we are not dying into this work, right? But that we are living into a new reality. So thank the three of you. Edmund?
Very, very good. One of the great privileges of serving in my role at the National Center for Institutional Diversity is just sort of engaging in this sort of intellectual exercise where we see people who are really just sort of at the top of what they do in their respective fields, disciplines in academia all together, just sort of be and exist, and we get to witness their talent. So I'm greatly appreciative to you all, beginning with Dr. Shahid as the excellent moderator for this discussion, and raising critical and poignant points throughout this the discussion for people to take away with them. Dr. Davis, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Williams, and incredible pleasure to have you all here. I also want to thank the committee of folks within NCID who spent many hours sort of thinking and conceptualizing a series of events around what does it mean to belong, thinking about the politics of belonging, thinking about sites of belonging, which is sort of what where this discussion landed, and even thinking about beyond that. And so I'm incredibly thankful for that group. I also want to shout out the production team. The production team makes they make these events seem like they are incredibly seamless, and they put an incredible amount of work to ensure that they flow in ways that we are able to convey messages that are critically important both now and in the future. I'll take 30 seconds to just do a quick summary of what I think I heard. Of course, I can't summarize all of the great and substantive thoughts that were brought up here, but I'll begin with just Royale sort of defining what belonging is, and that is this sort of basic physiological need. But beyond that, it is also a biological, it's neurological, in that we want to find people who sort of share identities with us, so that way we can interact and build community with one another. And that sort of leads us to one of the major sort of themes that emerge, this idea of community, being connected to the communities where we're from, being connected to the communities where we are, and the communities where we want to go into the future. And towards the end of the conversation, we talked a lot about courage and how that does not happen at an individual level. And, Charles sort of raised that particular point, particularly as we are thinking about individuals within systems or structures, right? And Royale pointed out the idea of there being an institutional responsibility to create spaces of belonging where people can sort of thrive and not necessarily survive. So this idea of being a courageous individual in an institution that may not see us as fully a part of the system in and of itself. Collective action was another piece that really came up, and I thought that was critically important. Again, directly connecting that we cannot do this work alone. And I really appreciate Britt's sort of reaffirming and reemphasizing the need to take care of not only yourself, but to take care of others. And that may look differently for different people at different points in time, but keeping that at the forefront in this work of belonging, especially in this climate and moving forward. I'm also, a member of a BGLO, and sort of the idea of discernment and recognizing that all spaces ain't for us, and knowing what that means at different points in time, and weighing the costs and opportunities that come along with that. And for some, the costs are greater, and some are much more willing to walk away, recognizing that is what may be needed from them in this particular fight, and not sort of shaming others in their efforts. There was this idea of material, both the material analysis and also the material impact. And so thinking about the ways that in spaces on campus that sort of signal who is allowed and who isn't allowed, but also thinking about the performative nature of some of these initiatives, activities, actions on behalf of the university, regardless of whether or not it's performative or not. To Brittany's point, at least my interpretation of it, is it having a material impact that is benefiting the lives of the students who are racially and ethnically minoritized on campus? And that is what the focus is, and primarily focusing on mechanisms of being able to measure that both quantitatively and qualitatively. So greatly appreciate that. Fortifying, Britt, this idea of resistance as a matrix, but I think connects to community, was also incredibly critical. The idea of being nimble and the conversation around the nomenclature and potentially having to name, but thinking about how we can become more precise in our language so that we are clearly defining for people and naming a thing as they say. And then I'll just end with these last couple points here. Charles, this idea of bravery in the face of uncertainty and in the face of imminent uncertainty, I think is really critical, and connects to this idea of joy, health, freedom, and not fighting the same battles that Brittany pointed to. And then I'll end with where Kyra started, with the question of what does belonging mean to us? Where do we belong, and who do we belong to? And as Charles sort of invoked his children throughout this conversation, and this idea of protecting their opportunity to dream. And so that's what this work to me is sort of really about. Like, how do you protect their opportunity to dream so that when they become in our positions, that they have an opportunity to sort of reflect on that ancestral sort of vestige around, to say that the people who came from me set me up in a way that we can continue to advance this work. That way we can live, enjoy good health, freedom. So I thank you all for joining us in this discussion today, and look forward to having you join us in future conversations with the NCID. Take good care.